Oh, so it's the question everyone is asking. It's a question that graces the headlines of major world newspapers. It comes up on talk shows. Kids wonder about it. Universities create courses to discuss it. It's the question that everyone asks when the storms of life are blowing. It's the most interesting thing about this question is that people ask it regardless of where they're at in their spiritual walk. I mean, even skeptics ask this question. Elton John wrote a song once that asked, if there's a God in heaven, what's he waiting for? Atheists ask the question. I used to think people who opposed the idea of the existence and presence of God were just stubborn people, but now I let people know that I've never met an atheist who didn't have a good reason for being one. And, many assume that after you follow Jesus for a long time, that somehow that you and I are exempt from thinking dark thoughts about God. But even seasoned believers ask the question along with everyone else, where's God? Where's God? Over the next few Sundays, we're going to take a look at this question from several different angles. And next week, we'll look at where's God when bad things happen. The week after that, we'll look at where's God when I'm scared. But today, I want to begin at looking at this from the point of view of where's God when I can't feel him? Where's God when I can't feel him? And before we look at this, I want to let you know that you're not crazy, you're not bad, or you're not a heretic if you ask the question, where is God? In fact, you're really in pretty good company when you ask this question. The question and the doubt that accompanies this is not foreign to Christians or the Christian experience. If you remember back, after the death of Jesus, who was the guy who said, I won't believe that he's really resurrected until I touch the scars in his hands and in his side? Who was that guy? Thomas, yeah. And so Thomas, he was, where is he? I'm not going to believe till I see. And in fact, Jesus gave him the evidence that he asked for, that he desired. Pretty interesting. And then after Jesus resurrected and showed himself, he met his disciples on a mountain in Galilee, and he gave that great commission, sending everyone out to tell the world about him and make disciples. And the Gospel of Matthew records it this way. It says this, when they saw him, this is Matthew 28, 16 through 20, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Very interesting. Now, Jesus didn't get angry with them and say, guys, sorry, I'm not sending you anywhere until you wrestle that doubt to the ground. No, he sent them out with their doubt. Sent them out with their doubt. So now even leaders struggle with the question, where is God? When the prophet Elisha was selected to replace Elijah, and after Elijah was taken up into the heavens, Elisha was really sad and angry. And he picked up Elijah's cloak that had been left behind, and he went down to the river, and he just slaps it. He rolls it up and slaps it on the water and says, where is the God of Elijah now? Of course, God immediately answered him on that one. But even a guy like Elisha says, where is God? One of the psalmists wrote a phrase, and it's in Psalm 31, and that's kind of where this message takes its roots. If you want to turn to Psalm 31, I'll be looking at more of it later in the message, but you could turn to a lot of different psalms and find people that are feeling a bit far from God and are expressing that. But here's One of the things that really stood out to me in Psalm 31, a moment when a person couldn't experience the feeling of God and sense God. In my alarm, I said, I am cut off from your sight. Verse 22. There are moments when we might feel out of his sight, distant, and the new car smell of faith is worn off, And there are times when we might go out onto a mountain not to, praise or marvel at God's handiwork, but to scream at the trees, yelling at God to make his existence clear to us. So I want to let you know that your experience doesn't make you a freak if you have had moments where I can't feel you, God. Where are you? I and many others here today have gone through similar experiences in our spiritual journey. But I do want to try to answer this question of why do we seem to experience God's absence? Now, myself and small group leaders and others here at Mountainside, we don't have all the answers. But my prayer is that we might be able to share with you a different perspective to this question that might give you hope to rediscover the warmth of God's presence. So if you've lived a little, if you've been following Jesus for a little while, like me, you've probably amazed yourself at how at one moment you can be at the top of the spiritual world, feeling like you're in a lush oasis of God's presence, and then the next moment you're saying, oh my gosh, my life is terrible, where is God? There have been times when I thought I had wandered off into a spiritual desert and didn't know if I would ever come out. And during those times, I felt abandoned, I felt confused, I felt angry, and worst of all, I felt without hope. And I think desert is the perfect description for the experience or the feeling of God's absence. In the New Testament, the translation for desert is from the word eremos, which means solitary, abandoned. Yet, the Bible tells us that we cannot get away from God's presence even if we try. Psalm 139, you hem me in behind and before. You've laid your hand upon me. Where can I go from your presence? Where can I flee from your spirit? The Bible describes God as being omnipresent, fully present everywhere, all the time. And the Bible also attests that sometimes our greatest spiritual transformations occur in the desert. Think about Moses. Where was he when God called him with the burning bush? In the desert. Where were the Israelites in their moments? They were in the desert. Where was David when he was being chased by Saul, running for his life? In the desert. Where was Elijah when he was going, oh, I've been faithful and no one's left but me? He was in the desert. Where was Jesus when he was tempted? In the desert. Where did Paul go after his Damascus Road experience? He went to a desert. As I have begun to grow as a Christ follower, and as I've begun to listen to the stories of Christ followers further down the road in their journey, I've begun to put together some of the puzzle pieces to where is God when I can't feel him. So one thing I know is that most of my life is built upon what I can experience through my five senses. Through my what I see, what I taste, what I touch, what I hear, and what I feel. And the problem is that God can exist and can operate out of the material world and my senses. He can operate outside of that. So I can only know God if he chooses to reveal himself to me through the material world, through my senses. And sometimes he gives me the pleasure of allowing me to sense or to feel him. And other times, He doesn't. So the other problem with my senses is how unreliable they are. I'll tell you a story about how unreliable they are. There was a moment, I was leading a small group, and I've maybe done this with some of you guys before too, but where you go around and every person has to tell a truth about themselves or to tell a made-up story, tell a lie. And then we're supposed to guess which one is real. And it's kind of a get-to-know-you kind of game, and you laugh and you have fun. Well, we go around, and one of the guys in the group says, I was born in Jamestown, New York, and I was on a championship hockey team in college. And with my keen powers of observation, I observed this man, and I was like, there's no way this guy was ever on a championship hockey team. This guy is the most passive person I've ever met in my life. Not a chance. And as I studied his face as he spoke, it's like this guy being a hockey player was the most far-fetched thing I could ever think of. And so I laughed out loud. And I said, yeah, right. The truth is you were born in Jamestown, New York. And the guy looks at me startled, almost hurt. And he goes, no, I was the goalie. I was the starting goalie on my college hockey championship team. And I just kind of, wow, I can't believe that. and you think I would have learned when it came to the next guy, and he said that he was a championship diver in college. But I laughed out loud again, and I said, no way. And he also looked at me hurt and goes, yo, really? I was a championship diver in college. So I'm telling you, my observations through my senses, through my eyes, my ears, my mind failed me. Failed me 2 times in a row when I thought I was absolutely sure. And there are times when our feelings, our senses, what we sense naturally fail us, and we can't trust them. Over time, I've learned that I have to discipline my emotions because they are all over the board. They really are. And sometimes they're not in sync with reality. C.S. Lewis put it this way: there is an art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. For moods will change. I know that by experience. Now that I'm a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks improbable. But when I was an atheist, I also had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable. A frightening thing to an atheist. This whole Christianity thing might be real. This rebellion of your moods against your real self is going to come anyway. And that is why faith is a necessary virtue. Unless you teach your moods where they get off, you can never be a sound Christian or even a sound atheist, but just a creature dithering to and fro with your beliefs really dependent on the weather and the state of your digestion. So that's C.S. Lewis. Now, another thing I've learned about not sensing God's presence, or sometimes what I call the desert experience, is that desert really burns up bad spiritual fuel I've been using for my soul. The desert experience burns up bad spiritual fuel. One bad fuel is some of the unhealthy motivations I have for becoming a Christ follower. I've acknowledged that I have had ulterior motives and that I don't have pure, uninhibited love for God even now. What are some of those ulterior motives? Well, I want to avoid hell. I want to find a Christian wife. I want to get my life fixed. I want to please. I want loyal friends, etc., etc. When the difficult desert time comes, I've discovered that these motivations were not nearly powerful enough to sustain my dedication to Christ. The cost of remaining a Christ follower outweighed my original mixed motives for becoming one, and I was faced with a choice: find a new motivation or walk away. The bad fuel gets burned up. Another bad fuel is living only for the after effects of our relationship with God, rather than for God Himself. You know, at points in the Christian life, we experience a rush of feelings. We experience peace, joy, happiness, warmth, excitement, contentment, a host of others. And sometimes over a stretch of time, we can unknowingly become dependent upon these feelings to sustain our spiritual well-being. We begin to pursue the feelings we receive from God rather than pursuing God Himself. But what happens when God ushers us into the desert and takes away all these feelings? We're forced to learn to love God simply for the sake of loving God and not for what we can get from Him. I've always been drawn to think about the greatest commandment: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. And I especially meditate on it when I'm in those moments when I can't sense or feel God. Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love Him. And, in the desert, my heart, where my feelings reside, my feelings are dead. And in those moments when my heart is unavailable, I have to learn to love God with my mind. I have to learn how to love Him with my mind, my mental energies and my thoughts. When my feelings and my heart are dead, I have to learn to love Him with my strength, with my sweat, with my muscle, my service. And I have to learn to love Him with my soul, my spirit, this new identity that He's given me. Probably the best thing that I've learned from God's withdrawal of revealing Himself through my feelings and senses is this: I've got an agenda, but God has a bigger agenda. My agenda is that I want to be happy today, right now, this minute. I want to live in Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong and the men are good looking and the children are all above average. I want to live where the sun always shines and people always get raises, and when people want to lose weight, they go to bed and the pounds just fall off. That's what I want. That's my agenda. My secret agenda is that I want to be happy, and I think it's God's responsibility to give that. But God's agenda is much bigger than mine. Way, way bigger. He knows that happiness is fickle and fleeting feeling. It's nice when it happens, but you can't bank on it. God's agenda is deeper. It's bigger. God is interested in transformation, a deep, personal, lasting, profound change in my life and in your life. He's looking to transform us into the likeness of His Son. And He'll do whatever it takes to do that. Even take us into a desert. Even remove the sense of Him. You see, that kind of change, that kind of changing into the likeness of His Son, that kind of change rarely comes through chasing happiness. So near the end of his life, the Christian journalist Malcolm Muggeridge, he underscored this idea when he said, contrary to what might be expected, I look back on experiences that at the time seemed especially desolating and painful with particular satisfaction. Well, that's strange. Indeed, he says, I can say with complete truthfulness that everything I learned in my 75 years in this world, everything that has truly enhanced and enlightened my existence has been through affliction and not through happiness. Wow. Every once in a while we should listen to some of these older folks that have gone on before us, these older folks that have lived a little longer, and go, okay, maybe it's true. Maybe this whole relying on my feelings thing, I just can't do that all the time. Maybe you can't feel God Maybe you're in the desert because God is working His bigger agenda in your life. Now, does that stop me from desiring to sense and feel God's presence? No, it doesn't. It's not a bad thing to sense and feel God's presence. It's a good thing. It doesn't stop me from crying out to God like the psalmist did long ago, back in Psalm 31. Be merciful to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and my body with grief. My life is consumed by anguish, and my years by groaning. My strength fails because of my affliction, and my bones grow weak. But I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. Let your face shine on your servant. Save me in your unfailing love. In the shelter of your presence, you hide those who fear you from the intrigues of men. In your dwelling, you keep them safe from accusing tongues. In my alarm, I said, I am cut off from your sight. Yet you heard my cry for mercy when I called to you for help. I will lie down and sleep in peace. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. So, I still want to feel and experience God's presence with my senses. It's just that I've learned I can't always trust my physical and emotional senses. And I've also learned that God has given us spiritual senses. Ephesians 1:18 mentions a prayer to open the eyes of your heart. Open the eyes of your heart. And my hope as I share this last story with you is that if you feel like you're cut off from God's sight, that you will pray. That you'll pray that God will enlighten the eyes of your heart. You might see spiritually what's going on. So here's the story. There is a river, and Isaac, you can come on up and get ready here. There's a river in Israel that runs from the north, from the Sea of Galilee, all the way to the south to the Dead Sea, about 60 miles. And it goes, so the river goes from high elevation to low elevation. In fact, going to the Dead Sea to the lowest elevation on the planet Earth. And most of the time, this little river, the Jordan River, is a peaceful river. But during the rainy season, rainwater converges from all sides into this basin, basically, of the whole surrounding landscape. And the water rushes down in there, and that river becomes a raging torrent. It is a flood. And it's recorded in the book of Joshua that God commands the Israelites to go into the promised land. And he leads them right to the edge of the Jordan River. And all that stood between the Israelites and the promised land was the Jordan River. Guess what time of year it was when they were right there? It was the rainy season. Yes. And the Jordan River was raging and flooding. It was a torrent. And there's over 1 million Israelites that have to cross, and they got little children, they got the elderly with them. So how in the world were they supposed to cross the Jordan while it's a raging flood? Well, God told the priests who were carrying the ark of God to go first and to lead the way. So they boldly walked to the edge of the Jordan River, and it's recorded in Joshua 3, verses 15 and 16. Yet, as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge. Can you imagine being the first guy who had to do that? Being the first in line? That would be the scary one. That's the one who's really got to trust. So he's reaching out, puts his feet in the water. As soon as he does, the water from upstream stopped flowing. And it says this in the scripture. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam. So the riverbed dried up, and the Israelites were able to cross over on dry ground. Now, where did God stop the flow of the water? Did it stop right where the people were standing? No. Did the Israelites see God at work piling up the water with their own eyes? No. No, it was actually out of their line of sight. It was in the town of Adam, 19 miles upriver from where they were at. So where was God? The Israelites learned that day that God was at work upstream from their lives. So many times when we're asking, where is God? And we can't feel him or can only see the trouble in front of us, he is working upstream in our lives, beyond our line of sight. The Israelites could have concluded that since there was a raging river in front of them, that God was not actively involved in the lives, but they would have been wrong. He was there, they just couldn't see him at work. What I pray and hope, and that you will join praying with me, is that when you can't sense or feel God, that God will give you spiritual eyes to see that he is always at work upstream in your life. So, Father, if our senses are failing us, give us spiritual senses to know what is true, that you are near at hand, and that you are not far from us. In Jesus' name, amen.